Just how porous are sanctions? The war in Ukraine's familiarized this show with the concept of dual-use products, say like a washing machine whose computer chip can power a lethal drone. France 24's investigative news site The Observer's got reports from citizen journalists in Iran during the 2022 Women Life Freedom protests about shotgun cartridges made in France and used in the crackdown on the peaceful protesters there. We'll track their journey from the factory to the streets and ask if all embargoes are tough, or is there something specific about arms embargoes in particular? In this case, the original product designed for weekend hunters, not for riot police. Speaking of sanctions, we'll ask about an Iran that's been living under them for years, an Iran that's holding its breath ahead of Israel's forthcoming response to missile salvos and a U.S. election with possible consequences on the scale and pressure of the isolation. Today in the France 24 debate, we're looking at Iran's sanctions-busting bullets. With us, one of the reporters who worked on that assignment, Ershad Alajani, journalist at the France 24 Observers. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks as well to Azadeh Kian, professor of sociology at the University of Paris-Cité. You are the director of the University Paris Diderot's Women's Studies Center, CEDREF. Is that how you pronounce it?
Yes.
Okay, thanks for being with us. From London, Patrick Wilkin, researcher on arms control, security and human rights at Amnesty International. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
And we'll be joined soon from Washington by Behnam Benatalablu, senior fellow at the Foundation for the Defense of Democracy's think tank. Your reactions on the hashtag F24debate. And by the way, the full report on our website, france24.com. Yeah, Ershad Alajani, 2 years of work here.
Yeah, thank you, Francois. The investigation began when two citizen journalists sent us photographs of European-made shotgun shells that have been used against the Iranians during the Women Life Freedom protests in 2022. What followed was a 2-year investigation conducted by the observers and reporters desk here at France 24. Now we can watch a short excerpt from that investigation aired last Saturday.
We were just chanting slogans. We didn't smash anything or hurt anyone. We were just chanting. After 10 or 15 minutes, the police attacked. They started shooting.
Hey, that! Hey, mother gender!
He aimed for my eye, and I fell to the ground. When I hit the ground, for a few seconds, all I saw was blackness and blood. I heard screams coming from behind me, the screams of my children. I didn't know what happened. I was terrified. There was lots of blood, and I was in pain. It was burning. And he kept shooting.
Elahe was hit in the face. Unable to find a doctor in Iran willing to treat her, she came to Europe, where a surgeon removed this plastic pellet from her eye. She asked him to film the procedure so she could one day use it as evidence. We wanted to know more. The France 24 Observers team launched an appeal in Persian on social networks. If you have photos of bullets or cartridges used by the security forces, send them to us by Telegram or WhatsApp. We received photos from around the country. We checked where and when each was taken. This cartridge, for instance, was picked up by a demonstrator on September 28, 2022, at this exact location in the central city of Yazd. Zooming in, you can see the name of the manufacturer, Shedid. Other photos showed cartridges with a circle of stars and the number 12. Another logo used by Shedid. In all, we identified Shedid cartridges in at least 8 different cities across Iran. Shedid is a leading producer of shotgun cartridges. The company says it produces 1 billion cartridges a year and sells them around the world. It is part of French-owned Sofisport, which supplies France's police, gendarmerie, and army. Sofisport is headed by Gilles Rocchia. Here he is filmed in 2017, along with French Defense Minister Jean-Yves Le Drian, at the opening of a factory for small-caliber ammunition.
Il me semblait que le chemin qui sépare la munition de chasse de la munition militaire n'était peut-être pas, franchement, infranchissable.
We try to contact Mr. Rocchia to ask him how Shedid cartridges ended up in Iran.
Bonjour, je me permets de vous contacter car j'aimerais être mise en relation avec monsieur Gilles Rocchia, s'il vous plaît.
C'était quel sujet? Je vous remercie, je transmets votre message à monsieur Rocchia. Passez une bonne journée.
We spent months trying to contact Mr. Rocchia and his staff by email, by phone. There was no answer.
Irshad Alajani, the report premiered last Saturday. Have you had any response since?
So far, we have received reactions mainly from Iranians, media journalists.
But not here in France?
No journalists, activists, and victims sharing our
No official reactions?
No, not yet. We haven't had anything so far.
Let me just ask you about this, Irshad. So, again, these are cartridges for hunting rifles, right? So,
yes.
If they are sold, say, to Turkey, and then passed on to Iran, explain to us how that violates the embargo.
There are two problems. First is that we found out during this investigation that the Shedid company actually had owned stake at this Turkish company, Yavaş Çalar. It means that 50% of this company belonged to Yavaş Çalar, to Shedid company. And three executives of managers of Shedid, they have been present for more than a decade in the executive board of this Turkish company. So it's not the customer dynamic here. They were the same company in some ways.
And just to be clear, if the Turks are selling them on, because they say it's for hunters to go out on Sundays.
Yeah, that's why in sanctions, which are in place since 2011 in Europe, they have mentioned directly any kind of sell these kind of products, shotgun shells, even the primers, even the plastic sleeves, even the metal base that they use for producing these kind of shells are prohibited to be sold in Iran directly or indirectly. The European companies, they must observe the chain of their products.
The supply chain.
The supply chain, exactly. And they need to vet that their customers.
The onus is on the manufacturer.
Exactly. Do what they say they do. For example, if they sell it to Turkey, they must be sure that it stays in Turkey.
Patrick Wilkin, your reaction to this, what is the responsibility of Shedid here? What's the responsibility of the French government?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think firstly, I agree with what Irshad has just said, and the amount of evidence that this report has gathered is really damning, I think, because the responsibility of both the state and the company is to be proactive in looking into all aspects of their supply chain, their value chain, and to ensure that their products are not being misused for human rights violations, even if it's a question of diversion, which in this case it could have been diversion. It could have been that Shedid was innocently exporting to Turkey and then Turkey exporting on to Iran, although the evidence from the report does suggest a much tighter relationship. But it's really up to Shadid to check where its products are ending up. We've seen Shadid products ending up in Myanmar as well, so they're clearly they need to look at where their products are ending up and how they're being used to ensure that they're not being linked to these horrific human rights violations that we're seeing across Iran.
And what was your reaction when you saw in that report that a clip of the then French defense minister hailing the product?
Well, I think they've really got to examine how this company is run and what kind of due diligence that the company is carrying out, because all companies have responsibility to respect human rights and to do a thorough due diligence to ensure that they're not linked in any way to these atrocities. And as far as the French state goes, well, I mean, I think there are multiple kind of restrictions on the French state, including the very specific sanctions that Ashad mentioned that were introduced in 2011, but also there is the Arms Trade Treaty, which the French state is a party to, and the Italian state that I understand Shadid also operates out of is also a party to, and in fact Turkey is a signatory. And that has very clear principles in it, similar principles that the state should not allow products that is produced within its jurisdiction to end up in places where it will be used for human rights violations.
And Patrick, just this Tuesday, there's been fresh sanctions by the European Union against Iran for exporting ballistic missiles. If the country is able to produce ballistic missiles, why doesn't it produce its own shotgun cartridges?
Well, it does produce its own shotgun cartridges. Iran has been heavily sanctioned for many years, and that has stimulated its own domestic industry. It has quite a strong domestic arms industry. But it's also obviously receiving shotgun cartridges from elsewhere, from Turkey. And that doesn't surprise me because Turkey is a big producer of both small arms and small arms ammunition. And we've seen small arms produced by Turkey in many different contexts, including in conflict contexts. And we've just recently done research on Sudan, the conflict in Sudan, where, again, we see Turkish manufactured hunting rifles being exported there and used in the conflict. So I think the other aspect of this is that exporting to Turkey is a red flag state. It has a poor track record in terms of its own exports. And any company like Shadid that wants to export to Turkey, or in fact, indeed, seems to have this very close relationship with a possible subsidiary in Turkey, that they should be doing enhanced due diligence to just absolutely triple check that they're not in some way linked to transfers of weapons into high-risk conflict zones.
Azadeh Khan, are you surprised that shotgun cartridges are exported to Turkey and then passed down?
Well, because they are French and Italian produced, yes, but not because Turkey sold them to Iran, because the Turkish government is not a democratic government either. And so they use all these weaponry against their own Kurdish opponents. For instance, and the Turkish military uses a lot of weapons against Kurdish opponents in Turkey. And I don't know where these weapons are coming from. Maybe many of them are the ones that have been produced in Europe, European Union, and they are being sold to or given to the Turkish army. Of course, I was very shocked, but this was last year, because this is last year that we saw the information that French, Italian shotguns were used by the repressive Iranian policemen against young demonstrators in many parts of the country.
Just to get the timeline straight on that, when did, because your citizen journalists in Iran contacted the Observer's website, when did they first contact you? Was it during the protest?
Yes, it was during the protest in September 2022. They contacted us, and the first part of our investigation, as Azadikian mentioned, that published a year ago, and this is the final part of our investigation that which we could follow the track of these shotgun shells, that how they could the European made shotgun shells could be found in Iran. At the first volume of our investigation that published a year ago, we could prove that these shotgun shells, they exist in Iran.
Azadikian.
Yeah, absolutely. So the information goes back to at least last year. And from then onwards, we haven't seen any answers from either the French government, the Italian government, those who are responsible for the making of these shotguns to begin with. I'm not talking about the Turkish government because, again, this is not a democratic government, and sanctions against armed sanctions against Iran are reinforced by the European Union, not necessarily by Turkey, although Turkey has signed the agreement not to deliver, arms to sanctioned countries. But as we know, they are doing it, and they are, again, undemocratic governments, and so they deal, they do not necessarily respect sanctions, but some of these sanctions that are not sanctions against arms and armaments are not being respected either, and some that are against Iranian population are respected. For instance, I think personally that sanctions against oil products, for instance, have been very much to the detriment of Iranian population. They have impoverished Iranian civil society, but these sanctions have not been against, basically have not worked against the Iranian nuclear facilities, nuclear program, or ballistic missiles, as we could see recently on October 1st, when Iran attacked Israel using all these hypersonic ballistic missiles, although there are sanctions against Iran. So, I mean, we should maybe be careful of which sanctions should be against the Iranian regime, which sanctions should not be reinforced because they are against the Iranian population. For instance, today the European Union also sanctioned Iran Air, which is the national airline, the only one with which Iranians can get out of the country to come to Europe or elsewhere. So this means that we are imprisoning Iranians inside Iran. These are middle classes that could actually travel to Europe, for instance. So what is the use of sanctioning Iran Air? I do agree to sanction Mahan Air, which is the Revolutionary Guard's air flight, but not Iran Air, for instance.
Not the national carrier.
Not the national carrier, yes.
Behnam Ben Taleblu now joins us from Washington, from the senior fellow at the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies. Thank you for joining us here in the France 24 debate. Iran sanctions is something that you follow closely. You heard Azadeh's point about how some sanctions hurt the people and others don't. Let's begin with these shotgun cartridges. Is it preventing them from entering Iran? Is that easy or difficult?
Well, first and foremost, greetings, Francois. Pleasure to be with you, and greetings to your guest. I think first off, hats off to the entire team at France 24 for this critical investigation, especially given the fact that many shotgun shells in the Massa crackdown and beyond were actually kind of reconfigured for bird's eye and buckshot, leading to kind of the splatters you've seen across the backs and fronts of protesters, largely but not exclusively female, and even the targeting of the eyes and the genitalia of many of those protesters for about 2 years now. So this is a critical piece of investigative reporting that unfortunately has not gotten a lot of press. And again, kudos and hats off to the entire team at France 24 for publishing this and sticking with the story. As to sanctions and in general export controls and trade controls, there are different tools and different strokes for different folks. Sanctions have a punitive effect that, if sustained and escalated over time, have a coercive effect designed to change behavior. Now, when you have an adversary like the Islamic Republic of Iran that is quite intent on not changing its behavior, the function or the form that sanctions take is designed to increase that pain, to maximize the punitive potential, such that if the Islamic Republic is a boxer coming at you with two hands, what sanctions do is it ties one arm behind its back. I think when you look at, for example, the April ballistic missile operation, not to get into some of the broader points against sanctions that Azadeh had mentioned, but if you look at the April ballistic missile operation, a 50% rate of failure for projectiles that you have spent significant amount of time and money onto is not a political or military success. And that could be chalked up to some of the larger kind of geopolitical desire to keep trade
again, I
controls
asked the question,
and economic penalties.
shotgun cartridges, is it easy or difficult to stop them from coming in?
It's doable, it's plausible on a level of challenge if you're willing to scale up. You have to go after the intermediaries. So it's not the French government, it's not the French firm that was mentioned in the story. It's about going after the intermediaries and jurisdictions of weak central authority and being willing to name, shame, and expose them, and to be able to devote national resources, whether you're the US, the EU, or the UN, to go after the musical chairs that many of these boards play. And that connection that Ershad had actually mentioned between the French firm and a Turkish firm is essentially borderline affiliate subsidiary when you have so much corporate overlap. And to be able to hold the French firm accountable for this kind of near subsidiary relationship, and then to be able to, as a government, if this is actually an issue for you, elevate that into the bilateral discourse between France and Turkey to be able to offset some of those costs. In the financial sanctions world, there's an acronym, KYC, know your customer. What the French firms are now really supposed to do is KYCC, know your customer's customer. Turkey, the UAE, Malaysia, these are historic, problematic jurisdictions for end user obfuscation, for military technology, for any other kind of technologies as well that the Islamic Republic has exploited over time. So if you put the assets, if you put the resources, it is absolutely stemmable. Nothing is impossible. It's really just a matter of priority.
Yeah, Patrick Wilkin, your thoughts on this, particularly because the arms industry is a world unto its own.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with those comments. It's really about political will and about devoting resources, meaningful resources, to try to stem these flows of weapons. And the arms industry, obviously, it has a huge conflict of interest because they're businesses, they want to export, and often European arms industries are getting most of their revenue from exporting and from relationships like the Chedid relationship with Turkey. But when you look at the arms industry, when it really wants to do something, it can do it. I mean, you can have a look at the due diligence that they've done on corruption and bribery, which, because of legal liabilities and substantial fines that many of the big corporates suffered in recent years, they have devoted whole departments to looking at how to reduce bribery and corruption in their business. So if they really wanted to, I think, and they devoted a department looking at exactly where their products are ending up, and did even a small amount of the work that this investigation did, then I think, and then after that they were proactive in trying to address those risks that they're exposed to, then that could greatly reduce the flow of weapons to problematic destinations. And I would say the same thing for the French state. If the French state really wanted to stop this, then if they devote resource and political will, they could definitely do so.
And my next question thus begs, Patrick, how do you rate the French, a major arms exporting country? Back in August, Amnesty International reported on the flouting of the 2013 arms trade treaty. How does France rank when it comes to its ethics on arms exports?
Well, I'm afraid to say that France, like many big Western exporters, have had an extremely patchy record and have indeed, while France is a party to the Arms Trade Treaty, has not followed the core principles within the Arms Trade Treaty, which, as I said at the beginning, was about preventing flows of arms where there's a substantial risk that they'll be used for serious human rights and humanitarian law violations. And we can see in many cases, France's exports to Egypt, we've looked at, and also exports to Saudi Arabia during the Yemen conflict. There's also the question of Israel, although they've stepped back from exports to Israel, but they have a long track record of engagement with Israel. So I think, like many big European states, the record is patchy, and it unfortunately, they haven't been able to take a principled and legal position on arms transfers, but are always being swayed by other concerns such as geopolitical alliance and advantage and commercial interest.
Yeah, and the arms trade itself, Ershad
Can I add a point to what Patrick said? That's exactly correct. I think if the European countries wanted to decide to stop it, they could stop it. It's a repeated pattern. We know that in the UN reports in 2016, this Turkish company is being pointed as for circumvention of sanctions on Libya. We know that some Italian media pointed at them in 2020 for circumvention of sanctions on Myanmar. And the same methods have been repeated again in 2022 in Iran. So the information for the governments, for the European Union, were not hidden. They were public. They could have stopped it. But I think it's a political decision. You have to decide politically to stop it or look away.
You have this dichotomy right now. European countries faced with Russia's invasion of Ukraine, discovering that their national armies are ill-equipped for the challenges of modern warfare, talking about scaling up their militaries. And on the other hand, what you've just described, that the arms export trade, is it operating in a different universe, a parallel universe?
I think some companies, they can find the loopholes in the laws, in the regulations, and playing with. It's not a military level ammunition. It's for sport. It's for fun, and they looking for the loopholes legally and the red zones.
How do you? I'll put it
like Turkey.
I'll put it to Benan Bentaleb. How do you make national security and business interests one and the same in this case, because the arms industry is not the same, or is that just impossible?
No, that's a dissertation-worthy and very noble exercise, particularly within free societies and free market economies, where there is a profit motive or a corporate motive for the production and the procurement of a private or a separate arms industry. These aren't essentially in America, in France. These aren't really state-owned entities. When we're talking about Lockheed Martin or Chetig or anything in between, these aren't really state-owned. They can serve the state. There's lots of government contracts for an entity like Lockheed Martin or Raytheon with the state, but it's not necessarily seen as a state-owned entity. In fact, it's a private entity. And what you
it's a private entity, but there's a revolving door.
There's a corporate revolving door. Lockheed Martin may not be the best example in terms of scalability with this French arms manufacturer. But nonetheless, the point is the same, that you have a private profit motive that can be of service to the state through contracts, but nonetheless gets to exist sans the state. And you have, this dichotomy seen in grotesque ways actually on the European continent, where, as you mentioned rightly, they're struggling to even get, at least from a NATO perspective, NATO countries, their defense industrial base to actually be properly invested in, to actually get some of the equipment that they've talked about getting to the Poles and then ultimately to the Ukrainians in the hands to push back on the Russians. But what has existed in terms of that private profit motive never necessarily saw itself as connected to the national interest. It's much more mercantile. And it is totally plausible and possible that you have these two divergent streams exist at the same time in society. And you see that today in Central and Western Europe with the issues with German arms manufacturers, British arms manufacturers, and French arms manufacturers. It just seems to be that the French one has run afoul of not just this profit motive versus national interest, but now this moral and strategic imperative of actually how their arms have ended up funding one of the worst actors in terms of foreign aggression and domestic repression in the Middle East, where there's lots of competition for that title.
Patrick Wilkin, how much money is at stake here? Just to give an order of comparison, when it comes to the arms industry vis-a-vis, say, I don't know, car manufacturing or some other big industry?
Well, the arms industry, actually, I was going to sort of get onto that point because I think there are two sides to the arms industry. One is the big corporates, as was mentioned, Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, and so forth, that are dealing with huge sums of money because they're producing things like combat aircraft, submarines that are worth, hundreds of millions of dollars. Whereas the Shadid is at the other end of the spectrum, where a cartridge, I don't know how much a shotgun cartridge costs, but it's a very small amount of money, that's for sure. So I think there are different dynamics here. I mean, overall, the industry is worth trillions a year. And obviously, because of the various conflicts in Ukraine and Israel, there's an increased demand. So the arms industry companies are getting more custom, their share prices are rising. And so it is a huge industry. It's not nearly as big as the car industry. I might add the car industry is another factor of financial value, but it is a significant amount of money. And I think with the big contracts like fighter jets and warships and so forth, you do get a very strong connection between the state and the companies because there's a mutual interest in these big financial contracts that could extend for years. But Shadid is something quite different, and the small arms industry is a much lower value industry.
All right, and that brings us back to the point that Azadeh Cam was mentioning earlier about what sanctions are just and which ones just hurt the general population instead of nefarious actors. Back in 2018, you could hear the sighs of pain when Peugeot saw the Trump administration walk away from the sanctions from the sanctions lighting Iran nuclear treaty. Yet, despite it all, it's only earlier this year that local car maker Pars stopped making the old Peugeot 405 sedan. When France's president met with his new Iranian counterpart, Masoud Pezeshkian, on the sidelines of UN Week in New York last month, neither side held out hope of sanctions suddenly disappearing. But still, there must have been those thinking about, Azadeh, thinking about, well, can those commercial ties be rekindled anytime soon?
I don't think so, although Europeans would like to see, to be able to reinvest in Iran, I believe. And for this very reason also, not just for this reason, but we know that diplomatic relations have always continued between Europeans and Iranians, despite, for instance, the policy of hostage-taking that the Iranian government had pursued and still is pursuing. For instance, 3 French citizens are still held hostage in Iran, for instance. But at the same time, they always hope that Iran somehow can become a state where you can discuss with and when you can have commercial ties with and so on. But I think that it was Europe and Peugeot and Renault and other French and Italian and also German companies who were the major, which bore the burden actually of sanctions that President Trump imposed on Iran, because those companies were the ones, those countries, European countries were the ones who were very interested in investing in Iran and selling their products to Iran, not necessarily Americans. And from 2018 onwards, what we saw nonetheless was that the European governments did not actually resist against the unilateral withdrawal of President Trump from a multilateral JCPOA contract.
And why? Because of the fact that the U.S. dollar has been
absolutely because of U.S. dollars
involved, and
absolutely this is one thing, but the other is because of the because United States is a superpower, and because Europeans had maybe other interests that they did not want to be jeopardized just for investing in Iran. But what you see is that this is not just economic, and I want to go back to what we were saying. This is not just economic or commercial. The impacts of it is what we see today. What we see today in the conflict between Iran and Israel, what you see today in Gaza, what you see today in the region. Had Trump stayed in the JCPOA, Iran would have been very different from the Iran we have today. The Islamic regime would have been a different regime. I think we should also be careful of the impact of this type of withdrawals, not just that. And then the sanctions that were imposed, again, I would say that these sanctions were against the Iranian society, basically. They have fragilized, they had weakened.
Okay, but the sanctions that hit the hardest were actually implemented during the Obama administration. Economist Esfandiar Batman-Gelij estimates that the major energy and financial sanctions on Iran from the 2012 National Defense Authorization Act in the United States had the same magnitude of effect on Iran's gross fixed capital formation as did, and you can see it in this graph,
it's not
the
true.
1975 Islamic Revolution.
No, because if you look at the growth rate, if you get the growth rate, Iran's growth rate, which is very much related to oil, revenues, it was 6%. It was 6% before President Trump withdrew from the JCPOA. So it was going up. Which means that the economy was getting better and was getting out of the international sanctions. Although the American sanctions, and you're right in that American sanctions still were held on banking and all, banking system.
It's about more than financials, is what you're saying.
Absolutely.
Behnam Ben Taleblu.
I don't want to take up the rest of the time here, but I do have some drastically different views with respect to Ms. Azadekian's commentary there. One, of course, the difference between the European governments and the European economies, particularly, again, that private versus public sector difference, was actually key during a period of transatlantic divide over Iran policy. So when the Trump administration actually left the JCPOA, it took 180 days to actually get back to where Obama was before entering the JCPOA, meaning the Trump administration first had to spend 180 days getting back to the high watermark of the Obama-era sanctions regime, which, again, seconds the point that you had with the graph there. It took about 180 days to reimpose, and then once they had a baseline for reimposition, then they began to drastically increase in terms of enforcement when it came to crude oil, petrochemical, foreign financial ties, these kinds of things. The second is that the European governments actually opposed this. The European governments actually created a special purpose vehicle. In other words, in Treasury Department speak, this was an illicit finance vehicle designed to work around U.S. sanctions.
Why do you call it illicit? They just decided not to use U.S. dollars is what they were trying to do and failed.
Yeah.
It is illicit because then the national economy that is choosing to use the U.S. dollar doesn't get to play it both ways. And that's why the major corporations, the major banks, the major businesses skirted their own national authorities. This redounds to the fact that the dollar is the reserve currency in the world. This redounds to the fact that even in terms of major foreign financial ties, the dollar still gets to speak first. It doesn't devalue the fact that there's only 4 percentage points of difference on SWIFT between the euro and the dollar, but it simply means that there is a massive, massive difference here between what European economies did from 2018 to 2020, which Azadeh respectfully ignored, and what the European
but to her
governments
central
did.
point
European
that
governments.
To her central point that the sanctions are hurting ordinary citizens a lot more than the regime.
Yeah, that has been drastic. That has been drastically disproven, actually, by ordinary citizens who, since 2018, have been protesting at the high watermark of American financial pressure, saying our enemy is. Pardon me, I didn't interrupt you, Azadeh, when you had many mistakes in your commentary. Iranians were protesting. You're welcome to wait after. Iranians were protesting, saying, "Doshman ma haminjast, durugh migan Amrika." So our enemy is here. They lie when they say it's America. So you actually had the torpedoing of the thesis brought to you by many leftist academics, perhaps like Azadeh, who always said that A, foreign support for protesters would be the kiss of death, and B, that you cannot have organic domestic protests against an authoritarian Islamist government by a secular nationalist society when you have major foreign economic pressure. And that theory was totally torpedoed and disproven from 2017 to 2020. And it's quite unfortunate that Azadeh today is more interested in having Iran Air make money when Iran Air, the national carrier, is actually documented by the Americans, by the Europeans, is actually ferrying men, money, and munitions to conflict zones around the world. It's an insult to the Iranian people that their national carrier is doing this. And Azadeh wants to find a way to make sure that they still have access to ports and services. This, in my view, is an insult to the Iranian people.
Azadeh Khan.
Well, I mean, I don't agree with what you're saying, because if you look at the Iranian population today, over 50% of the entire population live below poverty line, which was not the case prior to these sanctions. And I'm not just talking about sanctions. I know that the establishment, this regime is a corrupt regime, and I have already, we have discussed this amply and have written on all this amply, but I think that the sanctions have aggravated the economic situation, and for instance, the rate of unemployment of youth, for instance, has gone up, the poverty of the population has gone up, and so on. So you cannot deny the impact of these unjust sanctions on Iranians. On the other hand, the aim of the sanctions by Trump was what? The Iranian nuclear program. Look at where they are. At the Iranian nuclear program, they were enriching uranium as 3.7%. Now they're enriching it at 67%.
Patrick.
They did not have hypersonic ballistic missiles back then. They have it now.
Patrick Wilkin.
Let's face it.
Francois, may I respond to that? Francois, may I respond to that?
We're running out of time. Patrick Wilkin, I just want to ask you, again, getting back a final word, one sentence here, on, can you differentiate arms embargoes from other sanctions?
I think you can. I mean, I wouldn't want to, it's a very complex debate, but I would just reinforce that there is absolute clarity in my mind, and I think in most people's minds, that sanctions on arms and law enforcement equipment can be effective, and they are directly related to human rights violations. So there's a huge credibility and legal power behind, potentially behind those types of sanctions.
Patrick Wilkin, I want to thank you so much for joining us from London. I want to thank as well Behnam Bentaleblu for being with us from Washington. Azadeh Khan. Your report in full, Ershad Alajani, on our website, france24.com. We invite viewers who haven't visited it yet to go see our Observer's website. I want to thank all of you for being with us here in the France 24 debate.